Good afternoon and welcome to the Concord Bookshop. This afternoon we're really pleased to present author Jay Atkinson, who's going to be reading from and discussing his latest work, Legends of Winter Hill. Mr. Atkinson is a 3-time Pushcart Prize nominee who has previously published a work of fiction called Caveman Politics and a nonfiction work called Ice Time about hockey in his hometown Methuen. He teaches at Salem State College and continues to write articles for the Boston Globe and the New York Times. So please help me welcome Jay Atkinson.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out here on a beautiful but pretty warm Sunday. You could be doing something probably a lot cooler than sitting in a bookstore, so I appreciate it. I guess I'll talk a little bit about this particular book. Maybe read a very short part of it that describes Joe McCain, who is a Metropolitan District Commission police officer and then detective, and then after that I'll answer a few questions. But one interesting aspect about this book, Legends of Winter Hill, was that the idea came to me, or its incarnation came out of, I was finishing my other book, which is called Ice Time. And it's a memoir that takes place in Methuen, and it has to do with chronicling a year in a small town through the lens of the high school hockey team. Because I was a high school hockey player in Methuen, and I went back to my old team as a volunteer coach 25 years after I played on the team, and I helped coach, and I followed the kids' lives through the ups and downs of 17 and 18-year-old boys and girls as they went through their senior and junior year of high school. And right at the end of the project, I made my own son, was 5 years old. He was just beginning his hockey career, and I met the acquaintance of a guy who became actually a close friend of mine. His name is Mark Donahue, and he's a native of Somerville, and he's a police officer in Salem, New Hampshire. His son is the same age as my son, and we coached our kids in hockey together. And he knew I was a writer. He and his son appear right at the end of the paperback version of Ice Time because I wrote an epilogue to that book, and he and I were coaching, and our sons were friends, so I used that as a way to talk about like how hockey keeps going. Like every year, new kids finish with their high school career, and then new 4 and 5-year-olds like enter the sport. So Mark is an odd figure in, I guess, like broadly speaking, American literature, because he appears at the end of that book, and then he appears in a totally different context at the beginning of this book, and then throughout the book. Because Mark had been, before he became a police officer, he was a private detective for a company called McCain Investigations, which had its headquarters on Fulton Street in the North End. And for 14 years he was trained by Joe McCain Sr. Joe McCain Sr. was, as I said, this at the time retired Met detective, and Joe McCain taught Mark everything he knows about investigative work. And then Mark later became a police officer. So Mark knew I was a writer. Big Joe, as he was called, passed away shortly after September 11th, 2001. And Mark and I had known each other for about a year at that time, but we were just starting to get friendly because our kids were getting friendly. And Mark said to me one day at hockey practice, about a month after Big Joe died, and he had gone to a lot of memorial services and funeral mass and things like that, he said, there's this guy, Joe McCain, who's larger than life, who's this John Wayne-esque figure in Massachusetts law enforcement, and I used to work for him, and you should write your next book about him. And usually when someone says to me, you should write your next book about anything, it's usually like they're divorced, or their grandmother from Lithuania, which is, an interesting story perhaps, but whether you could hang an entire book on it or not, it's arguable. So typically I tell people, even friends of mine, I find my own subject matter and I never know what's going to strike me, and thanks for recommending or whatever. But Mark is a very persistent, dogged guy from Somerville who would not take no for an answer. And every week, and he's also much larger than me, so I tend to listen intently when he speaks. He's about 6'3", 230 pounds, and he's got ears that stick out, as I like to point out in my descriptions of him, which his wife does not appreciate. And his nose is like this. So Mark would tell me a Joe story like every Saturday as we were just getting on the ice, before we blew the whistle, before we got the kids organized, he would say, one time Joe had a fist fight with Joe the Animal Barbosa, and he knocked Barbosa down, and then when they got back to the old Met, is now the State Police Barracks on Revere Beach. Back then it was a Metropolitan District Commission Police Station, and there's old iron jail cells down in the basement level. I think there's 6 of them on the men's side, and then there's 3 that were reserved for like women prisoners. And he brought Billy Parsons, who was another legendary Met cop who worked on Revere Beach. He and Joe escorted Barbosa, who was a notorious, as Bob was just pointing out, notorious leg breaker and drug addict and not a really brilliant man, down into the cells below the police station. And Barbosa said to McCain, "You're not so tough. You're only tough because you have all these guys with you and you have a nightstick and a gun. And if you were out there on the street, just you and me, it would be different. The only reason why you got the better of me is because you're a cop and you have Billy Parsons and these other guys with you." So Joe sent Billy Parsons and the other cops upstairs, and he unbuckled his belt and put it outside, took off his nightstick, and went into the cell. And Barbosa had been standing at the bars challenging him. And when Joe went into the cell, Barbosa went and sat on the bike. He said like this, and Joe said, "I thought so." So Mark would tell me stories like that, and then my wheels would start turning, like, this guy is an interesting guy. So I went right around Christmas 2001 or January 2002, Mark said, "You're now ready to enter Somerville city limits with with me as your guide." So he took me down to Somerville, and he took me to Somerville PD, and Joe McCain Jr. is a detective sergeant himself. At the time he was 39 years old, and he was 14 years on the job in Somerville. And a big part of the project was going to be, did Joe Jr. and I hit it off? Because I was going to have to spend a lot of time with the McCain family and with their friends and with Big Joe's old squad, some still active state troopers, some retired, because in 1992 the Mets got merged into the state police. And so Joey and I had both played hockey as kids, and we both played rugby in college in Florida, because he went to University of Miami and I went to University of Florida for grad school. We both played rugby, and we had that in common, and we did hit it off. And when he got off his shift, we went for a couple drinks at a bar in Somerville called the Tiernanog, which is an Irish pub down in is it Davis Square? Davis Square. And so we hit it off, and then the next big obstacle was Helen McCain, Joe's widow, going to want to cooperate. Would she like me? Would she like the idea of the book? And so I went, after Joe and I knew each other for a few weeks, and we had a few personal meetings over, Guinness. He brought me to visit his mom, and I'm a polite, I think, Irish Catholic kid from the Merrimack Valley, and she's, as she describes herself, lace curtain Irish from Somerville. And we talked, and I talked about my late mother, and that was enough. And she realized that I think I had respect for the same institutions that she had respect for, which include, law enforcement and the Catholic Church and your parents and, other things that I was brought up with. And Helen said, "I think Joe would want you to write this book. I think Joe would like you." And so that was the winter of 2002, and here we are, the summer of 2005, and the book has been out for about 4 months. And I was telling the folks here at the bookstore, this morning I woke up in the Moosehead Lake region of Maine, which is a good distance from here, at the McCain's summer home. And Mrs. McCain has her own little in-law apartment up there, and Joey and his 3 kids and their dirt bikes and dogs and baseball equipment and other chaos has the rest of the house. And I spent the weekend up there, and last night we were up sitting around the fire in the backyard, Joey and I and 2 other friends of his from Somerville, talking about stories about his father that aren't in the book. In other words, people continue to talk to him about him, and he continues to fascinate me as an American type and as a character long after the book is finished. And out on the bookshelves, it's sort of like Joe's memory, and the memory of those post-Depression, Depression era, World War II, old school men and women who built this country as a modern country, as I understand it, the people who grew up in the Depression and fought in World War II and came back and gave back to the communities they grew up in are the people to whom we owe the debt of the society that we have right now in this country. So the fact that we're still sitting around a fire in northern Maine talking about Joe McCain, even though the book is finished, is not that surprising to me, because I think he stands for a certain type of American that, perhaps has passed away, and we should take note of that, and we should actually be quite sad about that. So I left there this morning at 8 o'clock, and I arrived in Concord about 15 minutes ago, or 20 minutes ago. And, one of the things that I got out of this project, which is quite interesting, yesterday I was there. They have this house out in the country, and they had a mountain bike, a bicycle that I could borrow. I didn't have a bicycle with me. And Joe said, he was working on siding the house, and his wife had to do something else, and my friend had to do something else. So I said, can I borrow the bicycle? And he said, yeah. And he gave me some vague directions. Go down here, take a left, and you go by a farm. I mean, if you're in sort of northern Maine, you're going to go by a lot of farms. So if you go down here and take a left, you're going to go by a farm. Not a very good direction. So I did ride out for like an hour and a half out to this airport in the middle of nowhere, little one runway airport, and then I rode back. And later in the afternoon, like a lot of people who do that kind of thing for recreation, I want to see how far it is. So I want to get in my car and drive the route. So 2 of his 3 sons said, well, we'll go with you for the ride. So I said, okay. So I got in my car, the kids got in the car, and we're riding along, and they're talking about the book, and how one of them's 13, the other one's 10. No, the other one's 11. They haven't read the book yet, but they're going to read it for their summer reading for school. I said, well, summer's almost half over, guys, and your grandfather, your father, your mother, and you are all in the book. When are you going to get around to doing this project? And his son, I have a son named Liam, and there's a Liam McCain also. And Liam was sitting behind me, Liam McCain. And as I was driving along, he said something which really struck me. He said, you wrote this book about my dad, and you didn't even really know him, and now you guys are like best friends. And they invited me to their home, and I'm up there, basically eating their chicken off their grill, and realized one of the enormous benefits of writing this book is I know all these people that I didn't know before, and that includes not just Joe McCain Sr.'s family and extended family, but a lot of guys that worked on his old squad in what was called the SCIP unit, the Suffolk County Investigative Prosecution Project. And that includes state troopers Chris Brighton, who's still on the job, Dennis Fablez, who's still on the job, Mark Lemieux, who's still on the job, and then retired troopers Gene Key, Biff McLean, Mark Cronin, who actually just passed away a few months ago, and Joe Doyle, who was an assistant district attorney who now is a lawyer in Quincy. I talk to these guys weekly. I go to their homes for cookouts. They, come. One of them, 2 of them have been to see my son play Little League. I mean, I have this whole new group of friends because of this book, and I think one of the reasons is that those guys certainly, from their law enforcement experiences together, have a really close bond. And the fact that I spent a lot of time with them, and really asked them a lot of questions about the things they did, the people they did them with, I got close to them too. And as a result of the book, I have this whole new social circle of people that are very reliable, and in all those cases, they're family people, and have kids or grandkids my son's age, and we do things together, and it's been, an unexpected benefit. When you're a quote-unquote investigative journalist, fiction writer, you often do not necessarily get close to the people that you're writing about. But Joe was such a charismatic guy, and his friends are such, I compared him to the legendary mythical hero Ulysses and his mariners. These guys would have been titans in their own right if they hadn't been eclipsed by Joe, who was such a enormously larger than life character. See if I can find a 1-page or a 1.5-page description of Joe for those of you who are wondering who the hell is it I'm talking about. At the beginning of the book, I talk about the history of private detectives, and I have this passage where I write about Alan Pinkerton, who was the Pinkerton detectives are still in business, Pinkerton Detective Agency, and he was in the 1850s, I think, was when he started his company, the 1850s, and he was infamous in some quarters and famous detective in other quarters, and so I sketch out the history of private detectives in the United States in just a couple pages, and then I get to the topic of Joe McCain. Joe McCain was 30 years a Metropolitan District Commission policeman, and then he got shot on the job in Hyde Park during a drug sting that went bad. And in the same exchange of gunfire, he shot a man by the name of Vladimir LaFontaine, who was a Jamaican posse cocaine dealer, a ruthless man, shot LaFontaine dead. So they exchanged gunfire in close quarters, and Joe got shot through the pancreas, but he put 4 rounds dead center on LaFontaine. LaFontaine ran past him out the door, high on cocaine and adrenaline, and collapsed dead in the street. And all those guys I just mentioned, McLean and Cronin and Key, they were all there. They were all there that night. That was the dramatic end to Joe's police career, because he recovered from the wound, but he could never go back and pass the physical again for the Mets or later the state police, but he was healthy enough to set up a private detective agency because he wanted to stay in the business. And so I describe him here after I talk about those things. Big Bluff Joe McCain Sr. was, like Alan Pinkerton, a determined fellow who could handle himself and handle a gun, yet understood that his brain was a more potent weapon than his fists or what he wore on his hip. Both men knew their way around a courtroom and a bar room, and their daily lives brought them in contact with some of the most dangerous and influential figures of their time. When confronted with the facts of Joe McCain's life, few would disagree that he was what used to be referred to as, quote-unquote, the genuine article. In a city where, for some inexplicable reason, chefs and restaurant owners are considered celebrities, and in a society that sometimes confuses victims with heroes, Joe McCain is as close to the Greek ideal of the hero as an Irish kid from Somerville is ever going to get. His highlights are exemplary: going toe-to-toe with the ferocious mob hitman Joe the Animal Barbosa, unraveling sophisticated criminal activities leading to hundreds of profile arrests, taking a bullet while gunning down a homicidal drug dealer. The list goes on and on. But the true measure of Joe McCain's character lies not in the arrests he made or the lives he saved, but in the quiet moments he reveled in. How he loved his wife and son and friends and was more at home walking his dogs on Packard Avenue than at the testimonial dinners that marked his career. How for 24 years he dressed in a red suit and snowy beard, augmented by his own white hair, and as Santa Claus spent the entirety of Christmas Eve visiting his friends and colleagues and the neighbors' children and homeless kids and kids with AIDS, sometimes arriving via state police helicopter to meet all his appointments in one night, ending up at home with his 3 beloved grandchildren who lived upstairs and worshipped him. How he counseled the wildest lads from the old neighborhood and beyond, like Leo Martini, whose brother was a Met cop turned bad that ended up in jail, and who became a cop himself and leaned on Big Joe when the other side beckoned. And Timmy Doherty, who crossed the blue line and testified against a dirty cop, and guys like Brian O'Donovan, hailed as the toughest guy in Somerville. Not to mention the men and women Big Joe put in jail and later befriended, and the victims of crimes he continued to advise and comfort and counsel long after he'd sent their tormentors to prison. And crooks turned informants he treated with genuine respect and meted out rewards and admonishments too with the forbearance of a kindly Dutch uncle. Joe McCain did all that and still found time to assemble a pretty good golf game for a guy over 300 pounds with a couple of bullet holes in his stomach. Although he was larger than life, in no single photograph does Joe McCain stand more than 5 inches tall. And I know him only via photographs, audio tapes, fleeting bits of old television interviews, and yellowed newspaper clippings, and through the tales and anecdotes of his former colleagues, neighbors, and friends. Certainly it would be easy to look at McCain's accomplishments and chalk them up to his Depression-era roots or membership in the quote-unquote greatest generation. But it's a peculiarity of heroism, especially in the classical sense, that the hero strikes out alone, that he has the inner strength and absolute conviction in his own ideals and abilities to go against the grain of even his fellow stalwarts. In an era where reality has become something we watch on television, the great pageant of Joe McCain's life is well worth examining. A genuine hero doesn't endure a single moment and then traffic in it. He or she doesn't take as the main goal parlaying their heroic experience into something else. As Winston Churchill demonstrated in World War II, being a hero is much less glamorous and more difficult than that. Simply put, a hero lives the truth. It's difficult to tell a story about being a detective that isn't episodic and profane, because that's the nature of the work. If you want politeness, continuity, and closure, go sell real estate. And certainly among cops in Boston and everywhere else, there's a fair amount of small-mindedness and bullying, and more than a few guys whose uniforms cover up their dearth of personality. But you only have to spend a night in a place like Somerville, or Fall River, or Lawrence to imagine what it would be like without them. So when a detective like Joe McCain Sr. comes along, with his hard knocks childhood and wartime naval service, with the street contacts and smarts, who can drink like a sailor and punch like a kangaroo and has the balls of an elephant, a guy who really enjoys the game and plays hard, you wind up with a collection of feats that, had they occurred in another age, would have been the sort of life the bards wrote songs about back in the old country in Cork. Thank you. Questions, comments?
I worked in Dorchester, it's not with Somerville, but like, and remember that author McDonald who wrote this book on South Boston about
Michael
his family?
Patrick McDonald.
He
All
was-
Souls.
All Souls. He was going to give book talks in a number of branches of Boston Public, and each time he had to cancel because he kept getting threats from the characters in South, which probably also were probably in this Winter Hill. I think they were all one big mess. And I had my whole speech all set in the Dorchester branch, and which was that time was like 95% Irish Catholic.
Right.
But he canceled out of that too, and I was trying to persuade him that, they were off duty. A lot of cops live in the area. I said, I'm sure I can talk one of them, just to stay there. But he canceled out of that too.
Yeah.
He canceled out of 5 or 6 book talks because of threats from.
And his
from
book
the
did
South
well,
again.
and it
His
was
book did
very
well, yeah.
popular. And, I met him actually when my ice hockey book was written but not yet published. We were at the same Christmas party, and I met him briefly. He didn't know who I
I
was,
read
and
the book.
his book was out, so I knew who he was. He didn't know who I was, and we talked briefly. But I heard that I don't know if there's much truth to this rumor, but that he now doesn't live in this area.
No, he
He lives on
doesn't.
the West Coast because of being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
What was some of the
He
things?
lives in
that-
Colorado.
Yeah.
Have you ever noticed the similarity between criminals and the police?
Well, I say in the book, particularly in the families that I talk to and the people that I spend a lot of time with from Malden and Melrose and Somerville and Chelsea and Charlestown, a lot of times the dividing line goes right through the family living room.
Yeah.
So you got a state trooper on this side of the couch and you got a convict on this side.
Look at both.
And, Joe McCain Sr., the fellow that I wrote about, and I talk about it in the book, and his widow will often, comment on this, and it's not a family secret or anything, but Joe's brother Eddie did like 12 years in Walpole. Just because a lot of guys, when they came back, particularly came back from World War II, there wasn't a lot of work there. Joe was lucky. He got a job roofing for the Hurley brothers. Then he got his union card, and he got a job unloading sides of beef at Stop and Shop. And then he waited 11 years and eventually got on. Took the test for the Mets and got on. But Eddie didn't find work when he got home from the service and started doing petty crime. And then petty crime leads to other crimes, and that's fairly common.
Well, when you said Barbosa was a bully, that's very common for a wimp. That should be expected. That's usually what bullies are, wimps. And he was a hitman, too. But what about McCain, Big Joe? He goes in and confronts this wimp in a very dumb, macho way, taking off his belt and, here, they're just the two of us. That's babyish.
1965, he was a 30-year-old, 35-year-old cop. There was Revere Beach. That's the way things got done oftentimes.
Well, that's what I meant about the similarity between criminals and the police.
Well, there's certainly guys who are
What do you think they
physically...
should do?
We shouldn't have such big parades when a policeman or a fireman dies. When you
Really?
said about celebrities being
No,
chefs
you
or
didn't answer the
hotel
question.
owners, You don't think that the police and firemen are celebrities? Those are the biggest parades for their funeral. They even come from out of state.
I have a
It's a
whole
brotherhood.
chapter about Joe
Well, maybe
McCain's
that's what it
funeral.
is.
in there.
What do you think I should do when you're challenged by a guy like Barbosa? Walk away?
No, you could be
Beat the
more
shit right out
professional,
of him if you
but
can.
I think they come from the same
Jesus.
roots.
That doesn't prove much.
I think this gentleman has a question here.
You've probably heard a lot of gossip while you were researching this book. A week after the London subway bombings on July 7th, Scotland Yard published their names, addresses, what color hair their mothers had, where they came from, what schools they attended, and posted color photographs of them on their way to their at the bombing. The FBI has been looking for Whitey Bulger for 10 years. I get the impression that the FBI doesn't really want to catch him. What do you think?
I think that, because I know some guys in the FBI office now that had nothing to do with, they weren't even in the academy when John Connolly retired. So among the newer, FBI offices, guys who populate the FBI office in Boston, one of them actually, Bill Chase, is a neighbor of mine, and I coach his kid in hockey. He's roughly my age, and is in his mid-40s, and he's now, right, temporarily, or at least for a period of time, he's the agent in charge of the Syracuse, New York office, and he commutes from Methuen every weekend. And he's got 2 children at home, so it's a long drive home to see his kids every weekend. But he would like nothing better than to catch James Bulger. The only thing is, there's only X number of FBI agents, and he's in charge of the Syracuse, New York office and lives in Methuen. What time does he have to spend on looking for this fugitive who's probably not even in the continental United States?
Is he the only FBI agent?
No, but each of them have, Whitey Bulger is a preoccupation with people of Greater Boston for a number of reasons, and he, in some quarters he's still considered like some Robin Hood type figure. In other quarters he's considered like the devil incarnate. The fact is, if you spend any time around law enforcement people at any level, the sheer volume of the cases that they have to deal with that come in through the door and over the phone to the police every day make it like prohibitive that there's enough time to go look for anybody. It's amazing that any crimes get solved, considering the sheer volume of crime that these guys have to deal with. And one of the things that I got enormous respect for, because I describe in about a quarter to a third of the book, my own fumbling attempts to work for McCain Investigations as a private eye. And all the other private investigators that work for McCain Investigations, which is now closed but was still operating when I wrote the book, are cops. They're police detectives who moonlight as PIs and oftentimes worked for the PI firm as a way to stay close with Joe, because Joe was their friend and they learned a lot from Joe. Real crimes, even simple crimes like looking for somebody who bought a car, made 4 or 5 payments, and then stopped paying the bank, and now is hiding the car at their brother's house and their cousin's house so they can continue to drive the car without paying for it. Those are the basic repossession, bank fraud cases that PI firms oftentimes have. A lot of basic cases like that. Workman's comp fraud, cheating spouses, really basic stuff that keeps the electricity on at the PI firm. Those cases are difficult to solve. Forget about complex murder for hire and complex like white collar, the Isabel Gardner Museum heist, where you have mastermind criminals planning it for years. I mean, I was trying to find this car in a parking lot, and we knew it was there. We knew the color of it. We knew the make of it. And I was looking at the vehicle identification numbers going, either my eyes are going or these VINs are getting really small. And Mark Donahue was sitting in the car watching me, and I got back to the car, and he goes, "You'd make a great friggin' detective. You can't even find a green car in a parking lot full of red cars." So, I have a lot of respect for guys who do solve cases, and the thing that you get spoiled watching TV is you watch Navy, NCIS, or CSI, and you go, wow, they solved this really complex crime in an hour. But when you subtract the 18 minutes of commercials, they solved a really complex crime in like 42 minutes. It doesn't happen that way in the real world. There's so many unsolved murders. If you ever talk to any state trooper who works in the cold case squad, which I think is like 3 guys. There's thousands of cases. I mean, I wrote about 2 pages on Danny Jaycee's unsolved murder, which several detectives that I talked to connected to connect the murder of Danny Jaycee, who was a handsome kid, young kid. He was Debbie Davis's boyfriend. Debbie Davis was murdered by Stevie Fleming and Whitey Fleming in, I think, Stevie's mother's apartment in Southie, because she was a 25-year-old girl that Fleming, who was then in his late 40s, was dating, and she was done with Fleming. They'd been together for 2 years. She wanted to break up with him, and Fleming was interested in her 14-year-old sister, Michelle, because he always liked young girls, very young girls. So they decided Debbie was a loose end, and they murdered her. And her body was found just in 2001 when Kevin Weeks led investigators to the, I think she was
On the
at Florian.
expressway?
She was either at Florian Hall or she was under the
On the
expressway.
expressway,
yeah.
that's where.
She was one of the
yeah,
bodies
I
that was there.
yeah.
Well, Danny Jaycee was her boyfriend before Fleming. And he died with 2 bullets in his head, so it wasn't natural causes. He died right around the time Stevie started dating Debbie. And he was a good-looking 22-year-old kid when she was like a 22-year-old girl. Now, connect the dots there. Like, he was a low-level cocaine runner for the Davis brothers. As the story goes, he was dating Debbie. Stevie just took care of him. No more rivalry from the handsome 22-year-old cocaine dealer. But that's an unsolved case. Now, that's an open secret among a whole layer of state police detectives and local police detectives that Stevie Fleming had something to do with Danny Jaycee's murder, but that's not been solved.
Didn't they find her body under the Ponset Bridge?
On
She
the
was-
expressway, yeah.
Yeah, she was one of the 5 bodies that were there, I think. I mean, what's amazing to me, and I've actually I've been on like television recently talking about this, that that now they're using Stevie Fleming
Yeah.
and John Martirano's testimony as like the central argument that John Connolly is guilty of murder and that this FBI agent is now going to be tried in federal court in Florida, or I think in state court in Florida, through the Florida District Attorney's Office for the murder of John Callahan, who was like a mob bookkeeper who had earlier, they think, ordered the murder of Roger Wheeler, and now Martirano and Fleming. Martirano actually pulled the trigger, I believe, and killed Callahan. But Connolly's been implicated as he tipped them off that Callahan's going to rat you out on the Wheeler murder. And as Joe McCain would say, and he's quoted in the book, when they turned Barbosa into a state's evidence witness and put him in the witness protection program and allowed him to walk, you already have Mr. Shooter. You already have a notorious murderer. What can he give you that's better than what he is? Why are you making deals with these guys who have committed multiple murders? Would they lie? Yes.
Yeah.
They're murderers. Of course they would lie. And when I asked a lot of state troopers that are on the job still that were trained by Joe McCain, why would Stevie Fleming, who's now, he's trussed up pretty tight. He's not going anywhere. He's old man now. He's in ill health. He's not, he's already serving a sentence that's far going to exceed his natural life. Why would he turn on somebody like Connolly and start ratting people out and go to the grand jury in Florida and cooperate? And the explanation that was given by Mark Donahue and Gene Key and others, which made an enormous amount of sense, was when he goes to the grand jury in Florida, he gets out of jail. He gets on a plane, he goes down there with a couple marshals, he eats at Howard Johnson's, he gets to go into the courtroom, take a look at a couple of clerks' asses, which he doesn't get to see in jail. He gets to stay in a hotel for a couple of nights. He's going to tell them anything. He's going to continue to get out of jail every couple months for the rest of his natural life in order to go testify against people. Is that testimony credible?
But it gives him some sort of absolution.
Well, that he can supposedly bare his soul and
Yeah.
What's he got to lose?
yeah, he's got nothing to lose.
What about ego, though? I mean, isn't it partly about an ego that I did this and now I can brag about it with impunity?
And I'm also in control still of the lives of retired law enforcement officials. So some people would say, and people have said this to me off the record and some on the record, that how could John Connolly be the only person in that office, from the FBI office, from the 70s and 80s, complicit in this enormous ring of like crime and murder, when his own boss, John Morris, who's retired with immunity down the Cape right now, admitted as part of his immunity deal, accepted $7,000 in cash in an envelope from Whitey and Steve. But he is not implicated in this murder.
That's why they don't want to capture Whitey, because he knows too much. I think they'd rather present us with a corpse instead of...
If they could, yeah. I mean, but there's a whole coterie of agents from the FBI office in that era, late 70s through to the late 80s, that were trusted. Jimmy Crawford and Matt Cronin are two of them. They were Joe McCain's hand-picked confidants, and when he needed FBI help, he always would try to recruit those two guys, and there's two other names, and I forget the names. But Crawford and Cronin are the ones I spoke to. And Joe McCain had left 50 hours of autobiographical audio tape that he made in the last 2 years of his life because he wanted a book written. He wanted a book written about his life. And he brought those guys in, and they were on tape. And then I talked to Matt Cronin at length one time at a Starbucks in West Roxbury for an afternoon. And he still does background checks as a contractor for the FBI. And he said back then, when they worked on what was called the Davis Brothers case and tried to hook Whitey and Stevie through a cocaine dealing operation that took place in Randolph that led them to later to Debbie Davis's body, years later to the Danny Jacy murder and all that, they didn't write reports that the two, Jimmy Crawford and Matt Cronin and two other FBI agents that worked on that multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency operation where they were trying to get Whitey and Stevie, they did not write things down because they knew other agents were reading those reports and leaking that information. So it was all on a need-to-know basis, and that's an enormous amount of trust when you talk about two different agencies cooperating and not writing anything down. That shows you how much they trusted Joe McCain and the Mets, because typically you wouldn't do that. You would want to have a paper trail to prove, first of all, that when you were on the clock, you were doing something. You weren't just golfing at the Charles River Country Club, that you were actually there working. Yes.
When you say Legends of Winter Hill, I'm thinking of the Winter Hill Gang. I mean, but your book includes personalities other than the Winter Hill Gang personalities?
Yeah, the Winter Hill Gang is actually like a very small part of the book. The reason why the title of the book is Legends of Winter Hill is Joe McCain, who's a legendary figure in Boston law enforcement, was a native of Winter Hill and grew up on Marshall Street. And a lot of the guys that he interacted with in the early days of his law enforcement career, he was right at the center of the Somerville-Charlestown, so-called Somerville-Charlestown gang wars, where the McLaughlin brothers and Buddy McLean and the sort of army of like thugs on either side clashed. Joe was right in the middle of that, and a lot of that took place on Winter Hill.
So the book follows the policeman's life and his
Yeah,
adventures?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's the only book written from the point of view of of Boston crime in the 1950s through the early part of this century, through the 2001, that covers it from the perspective of law enforcement, not from the perspective of the bad guys.
Is what he represents to you, sort of, whether you agree with it or not in that time frame, a form of integrity, that he would go against people who crossed the blue line, as you said it? And the other question I have...
What was the first question? I'm sorry.
Do you think he sort of defines what used to be thought of as integrity, which is that he would take the line whether rightly or wrongly because he believed in his belief and acted on his beliefs?
Joe.
Yes.
Big Joe, yeah. Big Joe had enemies in law enforcement who exist to this day because he often spoke out against cops that broke the rules. And he advised young cops like Timmy Doherty in a case that's continuing still in the Somerville PD. It's now a federal whistleblower's lawsuit. Timmy Doherty testified against 3 other Somerville cops that beat a handcuffed prisoner. And I cover that in 4 chapters in this book, because that's very unusual that a police officer would testify against other cops, especially a young patrolman who's junior, who's the inside man. The night that these veteran detectives came back to the police station, after being at a bar, not being on duty, being involved in a bar fight, they continued to, as Timmy Doherty testified in federal court, they continued to beat the guy while he's handcuffed. And one of the detectives bit his nipple, bit handcuff man's nipple off almost. Timmy Doherty went to Joe McCain, Sr., who was then retired near the end of his life, who was in the late 90s, and said, Joe, what should I do? I'm in a tight corner. I don't know what to do. Everyone at work is saying, if I testify, that's the end. I'm gonna be a rat. And he said, you have to tell the truth, Timmy. That's all you have to do. You go in there and you tell the truth, because you're being paid by the public, and your job is to do the public's business, and the public's business entails telling the truth. So Doherty testified in civil trial. There was never a criminal investigation of that event that I just described. There was a civil trial, and there were 3 detectives, and they lost a judgment for $155,000. They were found guilty of violating that suspect's rights in federal civil court. But Doherty was never able to really return to work because he got hounded out of his job. He did, yeah. He's out now on medical disability, waiting for his federal whistleblowers case to come to trial. And there's lots of, if you read the New York Times or Boston Globe, there's federal whistleblower cases in almost every government agency in the country, and they always get, driven out of the job and driven into like psychological distress, and always end up almost penniless. And at least because of that statute, they sometimes win if they deserve to, and they get, financial compensation.
But they're still ostracized.
But they're still ostracized. He's never welcome at the Somerville PD, even though more than half the cops agree that what Timmy did was right. But Joe told him that's what you should do. And Joe Joe testified against other cops on the benefit of John Salvati in the Salvati case. And he was retired then. But he and his partner, Leo Papil, who's also a character in the book, late great Leo Papil, Metropolitan detective, they both testified, and they did it together because that's the way they always operated when they worked together. What was your second question?
Where do you see your book fitting? Is it fiction, nonfiction, or historical
Nonfiction,
fiction?
yeah.
Nonfiction.
Where it fits under that banner, it depends on the bookstore. Some place it's in true crime, some place it's in biography, some place it's in general nonfiction. But I mean, one of the things as a writer that I actually amuses me to some degree is like my stuff doesn't get classified easily. My first book was a novel, but because the title, Caveman Politics, I would go into bookstores and it was in political science. Because it had the word politics in it. My second book is not really a memoir, but it often got classified as a memoir. And then this book has been called a true crime book by most of the chain bookstores. And in the independent bookstores, it's often just categorized in general nonfiction.
You cataloged crime in the library.
Crime, is it?
Yeah.
At your library?
Well, that's where they. I used to be a librarian. That's where they probably cataloged it.
Where would they put like those other books, like All Souls and
I'm trying to remember what. I think it was
Black
in biography.
Mass?
I think All Souls was in biography because it was. But it depends what system you're using.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I don't care.
Yeah.
But you have to make a living if you're writing for a living. And
Still teaching, aren't you?
yeah, I teach part-time at Salem State, and that's not a lucrative
State
Oh, it
colleges
isn't.
now.
thing as a part-time teacher in a state college system. Put it this way, I pay union dues, but I'm not represented by the union, so figure that out. So, I mean, I need to write and survive as a writer, so sometimes if your book is not easily categorized, that's not good. Because people go in and they don't know where to look for it, and then they find some other book they like and they buy that. Find out who the guy was. They had pictures of him and stuff, but they didn't know his real name because they had all these fake